People who feel safe inside their own arrogance often treat your first reaction as the only one that matters. If you are hurt, they study the hurt. If you are angry, they study the anger. If you are confused, they build their whole next move around the confusion. That is why so many selfish people prefer emotional chaos to quiet thought. They know how to survive the first wave. They know how to soften it, redirect it, mock it, or wait it out. What they do not know how to survive is a calm person who stops trying to be understood and starts trying to understand the structure instead. That is where their confidence begins to fail. Not when you shout. When you go still. That was the mistake my husband made with me. He thought my reaction would define the rest of the story. He thought if he could dismiss the first signs of my suspicion as insecurity, stress, or emotional overreaction, then whatever came after would have to keep passing through that same frame. In his mind, I was not a man seeing clearly. I was a man spiraling. That is a very useful thing to believe about someone you are betraying. It lets you keep your own conscience cleaner. It lets you keep the moral advantage while you're actively dismantling the truth. And most of all, it lets you mistake patience for incapacity. By the time reality corrected him, the correction had stopped being personal. It had become administrative. My name is Grant Holloway. I'm 49 years old, and until a little under 2 years ago I had been married for 17 years to a man named Victor. We lived outside Atlanta in one of those professionally landscaped neighborhoods where the houses were large enough to imply success and the marriages were polished enough to discourage curiosity. We had one daughter in college and a son in his last year of high school. I worked in risk oversight and contract governance for a medical distribution company, which meant audits, vendor exposure, policy enforcement, and all the quiet, exacting work that keeps other people's overconfidence from becoming expensive. I liked that work because it had standards. A sequence either made sense or it didn't. A trail of decisions either aligned with the stated story or it exposed something more honest. There was comfort in that. Systems do not care who feels offended by the truth. At home, unfortunately, truth had more competition. Victor worked in commercial real estate branding and investor relations. He was attractive in the socially efficient way some men are before anyone has really tested their character. Good smile, good timing, strong instincts for what people wanted to hear from themselves. He was the kind of man who made rooms feel lighter without ever seeming to strain toward attention. When we met, I admired that. I was steadier, more inward, more likely to observe before I spoke. He gave life energy. I gave it structure. That was the arrangement we lived in, and for a long time it was more than a story. It was true enough to deserve loyalty. I need to say that clearly because I have no interest in rewriting the early marriage as a fraud just because the later years became humiliating. There was love there. There was tenderness. There was real partnership. We built a home, raised children, cared for each other through illness, made it through periods of financial strain and one particularly ugly year when my mother was dying and our son was being evaluated for a learning issue at the same time. We had rituals, private jokes, Sunday coffee on the back patio, the 1,000 little signs of a shared life serious enough that its collapse would carry moral weight. That matters because betrayal feels different when it enters something that once legitimately deserved your trust. You are not just losing a person. You are watching a real structure get repurposed into cover. If I am going to tell this honestly, I should admit something unflattering about myself before I say more about him. I took too much quiet pride in being dependable. Not in a showy way. In the inward masculine way that often passes for humility because it doesn't announce itself. I handled the taxes, the insurance, the college planning, the retirement transfers, the home maintenance schedule, the emergency reserve, the vendor disputes, the folder full of passwords, the endless ordinary machinery of adulthood. I did it because I was good at it and because someone had to. But usefulness has a hidden danger. If you provide stability long enough, the person benefiting from it may stop recognizing it as effort. Then, if they are restless enough, they begin relating to your steadiness as a personality limitation rather than one of the reasons their life still works. Victor used to call me grounding. Later he called me safe. Much later, that softened into something less flattering. I became predictable. A little too procedural. Someone who needed things to make sense all the time. Those phrases matter because contempt rarely begins with open cruelty. It begins with taxonomy. You get classified, reduced, reframed. Once that happens, your strongest qualities start being interpreted as evidence of smaller emotional range. The stable husband becomes the narrow husband. The careful husband becomes the controlling husband. The serious husband becomes the heavy one. The first serious fracture in our marriage was not another man. It was hierarchy. Victor began treating his emotional states as if they had greater moral significance than mine. If he felt restless, that was meaningful. If I felt uneasy, I was overreading. If he needed space, that was maturity. If I asked for clarity, that was pressure. He began speaking in the language people often use when they want to make their appetites sound psychologically evolved. He needed room. He felt unseen. He didn't want to collapse complexity into blame. That line in particular stayed with me because it told me exactly what he was learning to do. Use polished language to turn my demand for plain truth into evidence of emotional inferiority. I should have recognized sooner how dangerous that was. I didn't, partly because I still loved him and partly because men like Victor are very good at making selfishness sound like insight. They do not say, "I'm enjoying someone else's attention." They say, "I'm trying to understand what's missing in me." They do not say, "I am already halfway out of the marriage." They say, "I need some room to think." If you are conscientious, you hesitate before accusing someone of bad faith under language like that. I hesitated too long. The other man eventually had a name. It was Adrian. He was an investor tied to one of Victor's larger projects, older than him by maybe 8 or 9 years, divorced, financially comfortable, the kind of man who understood that if he spoke slowly enough and carried himself as though nothing in the room could surprise him, other people would begin supplying depth he had never actually demonstrated. I met him once at a dinner connected to one of Victor's projects. I disliked him immediately, though not for any reason I could have defended with clean evidence at the time. He was too composed, too aware of how valuable calm can look when other people mistake it for wisdom. Victor described him at first in the lightly critical way people often use when they are already assigning interest they're not ready to admit. Adrian was too polished. Adrian thought in terms of leverage. Adrian understood how not to apologize for wanting more. That last line stayed with me because it wasn't really about Adrian. It was about aspiration. Victor was beginning to admire a kind of emotional architecture that made my steadiness look provincial to him. I noticed the usual things after that. More late dinners. More work-related drinks that extended past plausibility. More emotional brightness returning from evenings that were supposedly exhausting. His phone developed the kind of social gravity people think they are hiding when they are no longer paying attention to the face they make while reading it. But I did what careful husbands often do too long. I explained downward. Long day. Career pressure. Midlife restlessness. I did not want to become the man who contaminated a marriage with suspicion just because another man's name had started acquiring weather. The first moment he said I was overreacting came over something that, on the surface, could have sounded almost trivial. It was a Thursday night. He had told me he'd be at a client dinner downtown. Around 10:15 I sent a text asking whether he wanted me to leave the porch light on because the front sensor had been acting up. He didn't answer. He came home just before midnight, smelling faintly of hotel soap and a cologne he did not wear. I asked how the dinner went. He said fine. I asked which restaurant they ended up choosing because I knew the one he had mentioned originally closed earlier than the hour he was keeping. He laughed softly and said, "Grant, this is what I mean. You don't ask questions like a spouse. You ask questions like an auditor." I said, "I asked where you ate." He shook his head and said, "You're overreacting to normal life." That sentence did more than dismiss the moment. It was an attempt to pre-classify all future concerns. If I pressed harder later, I would not be a husband responding to evidence. I would be the man who had already shown himself prone to suspicion. In other words, he was not only denying facts. He was shaping the frame through which my future attention would be judged. I should have understood immediately what a strategic line that was. I didn't. Not fully. I still reviewed myself. Was I being too exacting? Too suspicious? Too attached to sequence in a place where sequence might not matter? That is how a conscientious man gets slowed down. He mistakes self-interrogation for maturity even while the other person is moving under cover of it. The moment that changed everything came from my son. He was 17 then. Old enough to feel the air in the house without needing adult vocabulary to explain it. One Saturday afternoon he came into the garage while I was pretending to sort tools and asked whether his father was still at that project thing. I said yes. He nodded and said, "He seems happier getting ready to leave than coming back." Then he found what he needed and left. That sentence sat in me for hours. Not because it proved an affair. Because it proved that whatever was happening was already large enough to alter the emotional weather of the house. A child had noticed that his father's anticipation belonged more to departure than to return. Once a truth becomes visible to a child, the adults no longer have the right to pretend it is still private confusion. I did not ask him anything else. Children are not instruments for adult evidence gathering. But I stopped helping Victor by doubting my own perception after that. The actual discovery came, fittingly enough, through sequence. We shared a vehicle app because I handled the insurance, service scheduling, and mileage logs. One night when Victor said he was staying late at the office preparing for an investor presentation, his car was sitting in the private garage of a condo building in Buckhead. Not once. Repeatedly. I checked the timeline against his texts, his meeting calendar, and the charges on our joint card. Then I saw a dinner receipt forwarded accidentally into our family email because one of his saved payment methods was still connected. 2 entrees. A restaurant Adrian had once described at that dinner as the only place in Atlanta that still understands restraint. By then, I knew. But knowing and acting are different things, especially when you still want to believe there is some version of reality that will allow you to remain fair and self-respecting at the same time. I did not confront him immediately. That mattered. If I had, he would still have had access to my hurt, and hurt was the emotional field where he believed he could still manage me. He would have narrowed the story, accused me of obsession, reframed the condo visits as professional overlap, made my sequence look like spiraling. Instead, I did what my entire career had trained me to do once the official story stopped matching the pattern. I built the timeline. Statements. Ride shares. Parking entries. Calendar mismatches. Messages from the old family tablet he forgot still synced certain notification previews. It did not take long. The relationship with Adrian was real, ongoing, and much more physically established than anything Victor's language would later try to imply. Then I met with a lawyer. Her name was Claire Donnelly. Late 60s, exact, dry, entirely unimpressed by euphemism once sequence is visible. I laid out the evidence, the pattern, and the fact that Victor had already started framing me as overreactive any time I came near the truth. She listened quietly and then said something that clarified the whole architecture for me. "He doesn't think you're overreacting," she said. "He thinks if he says it often enough, you'll stop trusting your own timing." That was exactly right. This was not merely about the affair anymore. It was about power. Victor was counting on my decency, my caution, my dislike of spectacle, and my need to be sure before becoming severe. He believed he could keep using those qualities to manage the pace at which reality became actionable. Once I understood that, I changed. Not theatrically. Quietly. I stopped asking follow-up questions. Stopped seeking clarifications he no longer deserved the chance to manipulate. Stopped explaining my unease. Stopped inviting him into conversations that could only serve his narrative. I remained courteous, present, responsible. I paid the bills, helped our son with school decisions, handled the house. But I withdrew the thing he had been relying on most, my willingness to keep trying to be understood by him. He noticed almost immediately. One evening, while he was opening a bottle of wine and pretending to inhabit some version of marriage we both knew was gone, he said, "You've gotten really cold." I said, "No. I've stopped helping you misname what's happening." That was the first time I saw something like genuine uncertainty in him. Not guilt. Not remorse. Uncertainty. Because he had been operating inside a stable assumption that I would remain emotionally available enough for him to keep shaping the meaning of events as they unfolded. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening when he thought he was going to win one more conversation through tone alone. He came home late, set his keys on the table, saw me sitting in the den with a folder in front of me, and said, already irritated, "What now?" I said, "The rest of the timeline." That line changed the room before I even opened the folder. Inside were the statements, the location records, the rideshare logs, the dining receipts, the sync messages, and the drafted petition Claire had prepared. Not arranged for drama. Arranged for clarity. He looked through the first few pages, then said exactly what men like him always say first when narrative control begins slipping. "You actually went this far?" Not "I'm sorry." Not "I lied." Not "this is worse than I admitted." Method first. My seriousness first. My response first. I said, "You told me I was overreacting. I just kept going until reaction wasn't necessary." That was the moment the truth was revealed. Not simply that he had another man, but that he had entirely misread the structure of my silence. He thought my lack of noise meant I had no move. In reality, it meant I was collecting the whole shape of the truth before I acted. Men like Victor cannot imagine that because they experience emotion as the main theater of power. They do not understand administrative consequence until it arrives. He tried, of course. It wasn't what I thought at first. He had been confused. He had felt unseen. Adrian understood parts of him he had buried. He never meant for things to move so quickly. All the usual lines. Some may even have contained fragments of emotional truth. Betrayers are often sincere about their dissatisfaction. What they are not sincere about is how much that dissatisfaction entitles them to distort, conceal, and reframe while still expecting the marriage to protect them. Then he said the line that completed the whole lesson. "You're making this into something legal." No. The sequence had made it legal. I had only stopped pretending that emotional language still outranked documented action. I said, "No. You made it legal when you decided my reaction was the problem and your conduct was just complexity." That ended the useful part of the conversation. The lawyer called him 2 days later. That is the sentence people usually imagine as triumphant when they hear this kind of story. It wasn't triumphant. It was clarifying. There is a difference. When Claire called Victor, the conversation moved out of his preferred terrain completely. No more tone management. No more psychological framing. No more gentle dismissal. No more "you're reading too much into it." No more "you always need things to make sense." Just dates. Assets. Accounts. Filing sequence. The ordinary, unglamorous language of consequence. That was the first time, I think, that he actually understood I had not been overreacting at all. I had been underreacting in the only way that helped him. The divorce that followed was not dramatic. Most serious adult endings are not. They are administrative, painful, and quietly humiliating. House valuation. Asset division. Tuition planning. Disclosures. The slow flattening of a once-lived marriage into paper. Signatures, percentages, and schedules. Adrian shrank quickly once he had to exist in ordinary daylight rather than contrast, which did not surprise me. People who feel expansive when someone else is still carrying the structure often look much smaller when structure becomes their own obligation. What stayed with me longer was not the condo garage or the dinner receipts or even the lawyer's call. It was the phrase "you're overreacting." I thought about how often selfish people use that line not because they believe it, but because they want your attention to become morally suspicious to you. They know that if you start reviewing your own response instead of their behavior, they gain time. Time is everything to a liar. Time lets them set tone, soften history, recruit sympathy, move resources, deepen the secondary relationship, and above all, keep the betrayed person emotionally occupied while the truth is still becoming actionable. A year later, while we were finishing the last tax issue connected to the house sale, Victor said something to me that finally proved he understood at least part of what had happened. I really thought you'd just stay hurt. That sentence was more honest than almost anything he had said in the previous year. I looked at him and said, "That was your mistake. Hurt is emotional. This became procedural." And that really is the message I would leave behind from what happened to me. Not every accusation of overreaction is manipulation. Sometimes people do overreact. Sometimes fear distorts perception. But when someone says you are overreacting before they have actually answered the question in front of them, pay attention. They may not be defending the truth. They may be trying to disqualify your access to it. That is not the same thing. If there is anything worth understanding from my story, it is this. Some people think emotional composure belongs to them. They think because you do not scream, because you do not chase, because you do not collapse at the first sign of betrayal, you will remain safely inside hurt long enough for them to keep controlling the frame. They do not understand that quiet men often think in longer timelines than liars do. He said I was overreacting. Until the lawyer called. By then, reaction had nothing left to do with it. Reality had already taken over.